probably, as I'm leaving, I can be a little bit more freewheeling with some of the things that I sort of think in relation to how the party has panned out over the last 4 or 5 years. And the way I see it is Liz, and I know Liz, we were ministers together in the Department for Education when I first got in under Michael Gove. Was me, Liz, and Matt Hancock, who were
what a group,
the three amigos.
Edward Timpson, Conservative MP for Crewe and now MP for Edisbury, is one of dozens of MPs standing down at the next election and joins me now for his exit interview. First question, I suppose, Edward, same as for everyone. Why are you leaving?
It feels a bit weird to do this interview, to be honest, Matt. It only feels like I went into politics just a few years ago, but it is actually now nearly 16 years since I first got elected in the by-election of 2008 when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. We've had quite a few since then, so hopefully people remember back in those days. But, I've been very lucky. I got into politics not long after deciding to put my hat into the ring. Only joined the Conservative Party in 2005, found myself getting selected for Crewe and Nantwich a couple of years later. And then the by-election came out of the blue. And before I knew it, I was in Parliament, albeit in opposition, but then was very, very lucky to have a good 7 years in government, 5 years doing the job I loved as Children's Minister. It's very rare these days to get such a long tenure in the same post. And I'm sorry that doesn't happen for more ministers. And then I had having had a dramatic entry into politics, had a sort of dramatic drop out of it at that sort of fateful 2017 election. And mercifully, my colleagues tell me I had 2 years out during the Brexit years when it was possibly the worst time ever to be a member of Parliament. So at least I dodged that bullet. But then I got enticed back and perhaps naively thought second time around I could just pick up from where I left off. But I think it's fair to say, whatever angle you look at it, the last 5 years has been difficult to sort of get momentum in politics, to concentrate on some of the long-term problems. COVID, we've had Ukraine, we've had energy spikes, cost of living issues. So for someone like me, it's been hard to sort of say pick up the baton from my first period in politics. And there sort of comes a point you think, well, maybe I've taken it as far as I can. And for all that time, my family have been living up in Cheshire. I've been down in London trying to bring up 4 kids. Just hit the big 5-0, believe it or not. And I think I've decided, actually, you know what, there's other ways that I can still contribute to the issues I care about, vulnerable children and families in particular, and public service, you can do it in lots of different ways. So that's really why, altogether, I think, it's time for me to let others have a go.
We'll come to some of what you might do next in a bit. Let's go right back then to 2008. Because it was that period, like you said, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He'd had the sort of the high of becoming Prime Minister, and then about a year later, everything was sort of, he touched seemed to go wrong, having ruled out that election. Along comes this by-election in Crewe and Nantwich, and it just makes me think of top hats. It was the by-election where the Labour Party sort of used this idea. David Cameron is an old Etonian. They sent people down to Crewe wearing top hat and tails to sort of pose up and wind you up and all that. You were called, I think, Lord Snooty, Tory boy Timpson, and all of that. What was it like being at the centre of? I mean, all by-elections ended up being a bit of a circus, but this seemed particularly wild.
Yeah, I think they were some of the sort of softer and milder things that I was called during that by-election. But yes, Timpson, the Tory toff from Tarpley, was the alliteration that they hammered upon. And yeah, it was a classic class war by-election campaign. So the sitting MP who very sadly died, the sort of long-standing stalwart, very independently minded Gwyneth Dunwoody had very quite suddenly passed away. Hence, we had the by-election. And I was almost literally thrown in at the deep end. I had no political experience at all. It was a real baptism of fire. And I found myself at the epicenter of this sort of maelstrom of politics where the whole of Fleet Street seemed to descend on Crewe and Nantwich. And right from the very start, Labour went on the attack. And as you rightly say, Matt, it was to try and to caricature the Tories with David Cameron as the leader, as the sort of out of touch sort of aristocrats. And they saw this Timpson, male, private school educated, he fits the bill. Barrister. This is exactly the sort of opponent that we can have a crack at and show that he isn't one of us. He couldn't possibly represent the people of Crewe and Nantwich as a man of the people. But they didn't do their research properly, and they didn't take into account that, in fact, my family, we're not an aristocratic family. We're a retailing family, cobblers from Manchester.
The famous Timpsons. Everyone knows about Timpsons, yeah.
Yeah, which I hasten to add, that's my dad and my brother are responsible for that. I take no credit whatsoever, or any of the blame for that matter. And my parents had fostered 90 children over 30 years. So we had this different side to our life and our upbringing, which is not reflected in the way that we were being portrayed by the Labour Party in Crewe and Nantwich. But it also is slightly desperation stakes from them because they couldn't go on policy. They were getting hammered on. Do you remember the 10p tax fiasco? There was the fuel duty. And it's funny how these things come full circle. The cost of living crisis that we were going on about. So they went for the man rather than the ball. And it massively backfired because the people locally just thought, well, what's that got to do with whether he's going to be any good as our local MP? We want someone who's going to represent us on the things that we care about. So ultimately, it was something which led to me finding myself winding my way back down to Westminster a few weeks later.
And it's interesting because, well, particularly now, if a by-election comes along and the government loses it, I speak to your colleagues, Tory MPs, says, well, there's only one election that matters, and there's the general election, the by-election. But actually, yours was was one of those tipping points because David Cameron had his own issues, as leader, and actually, it was a sign that the Conservatives could win in what had been a long-standing Labour, and it did that one event did shift the narrative as well. David Cameron could win in areas where the Tories hadn't. And actually, Labour's sort of class war wasn't working. So maybe it did tell us something about what was going on. What was it like then when you arrive doing this series, speaking to MPs who arrive in an intake, feel like they're part of a gang and they come up through and some of their mates become cabinet ministers and leaders or prime ministers, wherever it might be. But people who come in by-elections, you're never quite part of that same gang. Did you feel that? You have all that attention in 2008, but you're not part of an election intake gang.
No, you sort of fall between these different intakes. And when I came in, there were one or two others who came in on a by-election. There was John Howell a few weeks later in Henley. There was Chloe Smith in Norwich the following year. So there were one or two of us. Then we have a by-election club. We still have dinners now. Those of us who've all won by-elections. There's slightly fewer of us than there were a number of years ago. I think the Labour dinners probably rather oversubscribed at the moment. But yeah, you don't quite have a home, but you are also seen as someone when you come in that everyone wants to take into the fold. So I was lucky that I had someone who was called a candidate's friend during my by-election, who was an MP called Angela Browning, who essentially was like a surrogate mother during those 3 or 4 weeks to keep me sort of vaguely sane and protected from the campaign as much as possible. So she was my go-to person down in Westminster when I got there. And probably the 2005 intake were the ones that I came most close to. But even then, coming back in 2019, I was as a new MP second time round, sometimes called a retread, which is a slightly unfortunate phrase. But then it was like, well, am I now a new MP or am I an old MP? So I've not really had a home down in Westminster. I've sort of fallen between all sorts of different stools. But in some ways, that's been a good thing because I've been able to transcend some of these different intakes and build relationships and try and sort of be someone who is available to everybody rather than just being sort of cocooned in one particular part of the parliamentary party.
Do you think, we'll come to your time as a minister in a moment, but do you think it held you back in any way? Because there's always talk of this is the reshuffle when the 2010 intake gets, promoted, or the 2015 intake and that sort of thing. Did it hold you back in your career not being part of a gang and sort of moving on collectively? That's
a really great question. I've not really thought about it that way. And I think possibly there is something in that, in as much as I've never felt like a complete insider down in Westminster. I say politics wasn't something that I was brought up involved with. I mean, I read politics at university, always interested in it, but no one in my family's ever done it before. I wasn't someone who worked at Conservative Central Office. I wasn't a special advisor. I hadn't got involved in local politics particularly until a few years before I got elected as an MP. So I didn't have all of those links that a lot of colleagues do, particularly in an intake when they come in. But having said that, I had the advantage of a couple of years in opposition, so I've tasted that. It's not great, but at least we were on the up, and we knew that there was a good chance of getting into government. And then, fortunately for me, I sat quite comfortably in a coalition government. I was the sort of person who could be pragmatic, who could build consensus, and was on the ministerial ladder quite quickly. So that didn't hold me back. The thing that has been the biggest fall for me was losing my seat in 2017 and starting again, because then you almost go back to the end of the queue, irrespective of the experience that you've already brought to bear in previous ministerial roles. So maybe if I had still been in an intake previously when I came back again, they would have been able to give me a shout out a little bit more when it came to reshuffle. But I've never been someone necessarily who was sort of sharp elbowed and pushing my way to the front. And maybe that's something that's also held me back second time around.
You did have, as you mentioned, a decent chunk of time though as an education minister. Was it 3 years under Michael Gove first, and then Nicky Morgan, and then Justin Greeding as well. So so actually that's a decent chunk of time. I was looking since you were there. There've been 10 people in the same job in the past 6 years. So what do you feel like you managed to achieve when you were in the Department for Education?
Well, the great thing about, and obviously when you start out, you don't know how long you're going to have. My predecessor, Tim Lawton, who'd been the shadow children's minister for forever, had 2 years as a minister and then was moved on, unfortunately, because of the jostling for position with Liberal Democrats in the coalition and not enough space for everybody. So I didn't know how long I was going to be there, and you sometimes get moved on to another job. But I was able to use the tenure that I had, first of all, to have the really strong backing of the Prime Minister on my policy agenda. So things like adoption, special educational needs, children's social care, and also my Secretary of State the first 3 years, Michael Gove, who himself is adopted. They gave me a real platform and trusted me just to get on with it. Gave me a legislative slot, so I put big bill through Parliament, did some important improvements on like the family justice system, on fostering, raising the age that children leave foster care from 18 to 21, and the whole reform of special educational needs, although maybe come on to the implementation of that after I'd gone later on. But so to go through that whole process of developing a policy, testing it out, taking it through Parliament, and then have a period where you're then responsible for making sure, does it actually work for people and change their lives? To go through that whole cycle of a policy is quite rare for a minister, but I was able to do that. And also with officials who I sort of got to believe in what we were doing, rather than them also just doing what the minister tells them to do. I asked them and made sure that they gave me sort of critical friend support, as well as just carrying out the orders of those at the top of the department. So for me, it was as fulfilling as a ministerial role could have been. There's lots of ministerial roles where you keep the plates spinning on the, as much as you can, but you don't get the backing from the top, the time and space to actually develop policy. You don't get time in Parliament to then put something into law that you need to make the changes and the reforms that you're prioritising. And you don't stay long enough to see whether it works and maybe change course or tack or ask for sort of further changes further down the line. So for me, I would have liked to stay for a couple of more years. I think 7 years is about the sweet spot for a minister. Probably by then it needs some fresh eyes, but it gave me enough time to really get into the weeds of policy and work with not just people in Parliament, but people in local government, in charities, parents, children themselves, to really make sure what we're doing people could get behind and transform into something meaningful.
And the interesting is then if you multiply what you're saying about all the chopping and changing over recent years, means you haven't had that consistency in the check and balance and coming up with an idea and seeing all the way through. That multiplied across every ministerial job in every government department across Whitehall might actually go some way to explain why right now there's a feeling that there's not a lot going on in government. There's all things are a bit broken and there's no long-term. I suppose it's not a great surprise if the experience you've been talking about in one area of education policy has actually been replicated right across government. Is it to go some way to explaining why this government right now feels like there's not very much going on?
Well, I think there is some great stuff going on, but the problem is that there's so much other noise as well around it. Plus, those ministers who I sit on the Justice Select Committee, we grill the ministers in that department, and to be fair, they're really dedicated to the role that they've been given. But there has been so much churn, we can't deny that, for all sorts of reasons that everybody knows, to enable even the very best ministers to get to grips with whatever their role is, whatever their portfolio is, and turn it into something which has real life impact. And we're now so far away from the last election, some of those manifesto commitments, the things that define the government then, the world's changed massively. And we're now in election mode. And that then takes the way that Whitehall works and what ministers are being asked to do into a whole different sphere. So, yes, there's been huge amounts of turnover, and that is never good in any organisation. I'm sure the Times Radio doesn't want to see its presenters changing every 5 minutes. They want to stick with those who do a good job and get great ratings. But that's not the nature of politics, unfortunately. In every government, you've seen it, Labour, Conservative, end up in this cycle of where they started off with wanting to have ministers in position, sort of the round pegs in round holes scenario. They might actually know a little bit about their brief before they go into it, and then they stick with it. And we've had examples of that. There was myself, Nick Gibb, who was schools minister for over a decade. But they're the exceptions to the rule in every government. That is an unfortunate part of why Whitehall doesn't always work.
Michael Gove, one of your old bosses as Education Secretary, I mean, he was somebody who thought about it a lot before he came in and then sort of set about what he wanted to do. And is seen as someone who gets stuff done, whatever department he's put in. It is one of the great survivors. Would you rule out him having another crack at leading the Tory party?
I don't think you can ever rule out what Michael's going to do next, if I'm brutally honest. And I got on very well with him in the department for education when he was secretary. As I said, he gave me a brief that he just let me run with, and very rarely did he give me pushback. So I've got a lot of respect for him in that regard. He has had a few shots at it, and I think probably there comes a point where any political generation gets moved on, and the next start coming through. And I suspect whatever happens in the next election, that's likely to be the case. In my view, is the sensible thing to do if you're going to put yourself back in front of the country in a way that says, look, we're new, we're fresh, we're different, we're ready for the next sort of change that the country needs. That's the point where maybe it's time for others to have a go.
And I suppose we should talk about the gap, your gap year. So you lost your seat in the 2017 election. You'd been an MP then for what, 9 years. You could have been forgiven for saying that. That's enough. I've done my bit. The electorate has spoken. What made you want to go back and have another go in a different seat, sort of building it all up again?
I think there are a number of factors. The first of all was the manner in which I lost my seat, and you've got to remember 3 or 4 weeks before the 2017 general election day, Conservatives had great local election results. I think at one point like 25 points ahead in the polls. And, I'd been Theresa May's parliamentary private secretary for a couple of years before I became a minister. So I knew her, reasonably well. And so was hopeful that she'd made the right call. But, as we know, during the campaign, things sort of inverted pyramid came into play. And before we knew it, we were struggling to sort of get the numbers up. And for me, particularly as a minister, I was a target on things like education cuts, which are part of Labour's policy and platform and campaigning. And on the night, I actually got more votes than I've ever got in any election. I think I found every Conservative in Crewe and Nantwich. We'd gone from 12,000 votes in 2005 to I think nearly 26,000 in 2017. And on the first count, I was ahead by 69 votes from memory. And by the second recount, I was behind by 48, which was 47% of the vote against 47.1% of the vote. Don't we love first past the post? I did until that night. And so it was devastating because, okay, I'd lost my seat. That's the way the cookie crumbles, but you lose your ministerial role. And also all your staff lose their jobs. People don't often realise this, so they were in tears. And So I felt quite beaten up by the whole experience. And during the campaign, I'd had a very nasty incident where I'd had protesters on our roof at home who'd forced ourselves onto our property, and we'd had to leave under police protection. And we just had a baby not a few months before then. So it was very difficult for my wife and my kids. So you could forgive me for thinking, well, that's it, really. You know, I've given everything I've got. But unfortunately, I'm a really sort of competitive person. Very quietly, I don't like to think that someone else has got the better of me. And so there was a little thought in the back of my mind that maybe I need to get back and prove to people that's not the end of Edward Timpson in politics. So that stubborn aspect. Then there was the sense of unfinished business. I said before, you know, I've been children's minister for nearly 5 years. I felt I had another couple of good years as children's minister, things I wanted to see through to their conclusion, things like special education needs reform, making sure that the workforce development that was needed to deal with the capacity within the system, things like that. So it was in the back of my mind. And I did start through those 2 years out of Parliament. I didn't know how long it was going to be for. It could have been 5 years, could be not an election for quite a long time, to carve out a different existence around vulnerable children. So I chaired CAFCAS, the Children and Family Court Advisory and Support Service. They're all the social workers who are in the family courts. I chaired the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, which slightly embarrassingly was something I just set up in legislation before I lost my seat. But that's looking at sort of serious cases where a child died or has been a serious injury, and understanding some of the practical reasons behind that. And themes across the country, and making recommendations. And I did an independent review for the government on school exclusion. So I found lots of things in that same policy sphere, but there was just still this inkling in the back of my mind that I've still got something to give in politics. And then, completely out of, again, the blue, my local seat where I live, Edisbury, which is next door to Crewe and Nantwich, came up for selection because the sitting Conservative MP, Antoinette Sambach, who had been my colleague next door in the previous election, had lost the whip because she had been one of the Brexit rebels and went an independent, and then actually stood against me as the Liberal Democrat candidate. So that was a slightly strange experience to suddenly find myself doing hustings against my former colleague. But because that seat came up, I thought, well, this is never going to happen again. And Edisbury is a very different seat to Crewe and Nantwich, despite the fact they're neighbours. If you can call a seat a safe seat these days, it has more of the connotations of one, let's put it that way, compared to Crewe and Nantwich, which is always like pushing water uphill for a Conservative, although we did win it again in 2019. And so all these factors came together. I thought, okay, I'm going to go, and this is going to be good. And I'm going to make the most of this second chance, because very few people get them in politics. Not that I've done anything wrong. I just been the victim of democracy, which is probably what you have to expect as a politician.
Yeah, exactly. You live by the sword and die with the sword and all that, I suppose. But let's go through some of your bosses then as a proper exit interview exercise. Let's sum up David Cameron in a word.
How would I sum up in one word? Professional. Yeah, as soon as I met him, which was very soon after I got, I think the rubber stamped, maybe not quite rubber stamped, but kept on as the by-election candidate. And I got whisked down to London and had I think Caroline Spellman was the chair of the party then, and she did the sort of skeletons in your cupboard conversation, and is there anything we should know? And I remember meeting him and Lord Ashcroft down then, and being told in no uncertain terms that only I could mess this up. So I knew the pressure was on, but I could tell that right from the very start that David Cameron, you know, he had his head screwed on. He got a very clear idea of what he wanted to achieve. And I think we've seen, actually, in my view, since he's come back as Foreign Secretary, which I know was something he always harboured to do at some stage in his career. So again, he probably never thought that would happen, but it has. That he's still got that professionalism and able to grapple a problem very quickly, articulate it well, and also he's a good campaigner, I think.
Well, from that to the woman who cost you your seat, sum up Theresa May in a word.
Well, as I said, I spent 2 years as a parliamentary private secretary in the Home Office, so got to spend a lot of time with her. I've never seen anyone who works so hard, really, genuinely cares about the issues that she's trying to grapple with, modern slavery being the one I think is probably going to be her legacy and one she's going to continue with. We spent a lot of time in the Home Office. We probably should have spent more time in Parliament. And I don't think that was more necessarily a natural habitat to sort of go around socialising in the bars and the tea rooms and things. But up until the point, you have to remember, up until that election, in terms of her diligence, her competence, the things that actually people want to see in a prime minister, she definitely had those. Where she struggled, which is no secret really, is just on the communication side and really getting a bond with people, that a sense that people could connect to her and feel that she was really on their side. The sort of something that probably Margaret Thatcher did have, which Theresa May struggled a little bit more with. But I still sit next to her at Prime Minister's Questions, albeit she sits on a seat and I sit on a step, because I know my place still.
Just explain for people who don't know what being a PPS is. It's Parliamentary Private Secretary is the formal title. Bag carrier is the less common one. Explain what that actually involves. So Theresa May's there, the Home Secretary. You're, very bottom rung, unpaid, working in, as a government, a member of the government. What do you have to do? Is it just getting coffees and opening doors?
Well, there's a little bit of that. It's sort of, chaperoning your minister. So it's mainly Secretary of State, those are in the cabinet who have a PPS, but also Ministers of State, which is like the next rung down from cabinet, occasionally do as well, or share one with other ministers. And essentially, you're their eyes and ears in Parliament. So you're there to get feedback from colleagues on things they're concerned about, to make sure that in the department that your minister's responsible for, that they're sort of on top of those and they can reassure them. But also you're there to cascade your ministers' sort of views, ideas, legislation that they want to take through, just to test it out, but also corral support for things like when they're having to answer questions in Parliament. So get a team together of backbenchers who will come along to Home Office questions and rally behind her and her ministerial team. It's changed a little bit since I did it, to be honest. It's because I was so far back doing it. It wasn't when WhatsApp was in full flow. Whereas now I think a lot of PPSs get inundated with individual case requests from MPs saying, "Oh, can you just chase up this in the department?" So it's morphed a little bit more into almost like an extension of the private office that a minister has. Whereas in my day, it was very much just chatting to colleagues and just making sure that they were supportive of what Theresa May was doing as Home Secretary.
It's interesting that, and lots of people probably wouldn't know that. Sum up Boris Johnson in a word.
Well, I got to get to know Boris Johnson a little bit on the Hartlepool by-election, which, if you remember, was sort of not quite peak Boris, but you remember there was this big blow-up Boris.
The blue,
yeah. I'd spent 5 weeks up there with our candidate, and I was there as the candidate's friend, so I mentioned the one that I had during my by-election. So I was doing the same in Hartlepool, and it was actually quite like my by-election, because we were like the insurgents. We were coming into a Labour seat, which had always been Labour. And I remember the very first day we went campaigning, we went on to one of the housing estates in Hartlepool. It was a beautiful day, and we thought, well, this doesn't feel like fertile territory for us, but let's give it a go. And literally the first place that we saw some people in the front garden, they say, who are you for? We say it's Conservatives. They say, is that Boris? Yeah, Boris. Yeah. Boy, I love Boris. Boris is brilliant. Bring back Boris, or whatever their phrase was. And it was palpable. There was this almost, not quite say messianic, but there was a real sense that his personality was driving people towards the Conservative Party in Hartlepool. And we ended up winning that by-election, which is very rare for a sitting government to win a seat off the opposition. But of course, that was the plus side of him. And then because a few weeks later, I was also being a candidate's friend for the by-election in Chesham and Amersham. And it was almost the polar opposite. It was like, we better keep Boris away from him because he's not going down very well. And that really sums him up. Is he's one of these people who can he can force people into quite sort of extreme reactions as to whether they love him or they hate him. They think he's the best thing since sliced bread, or a buffoon who should never have got anywhere near Downing Street. And in my dealings with him, what you come across, and you would have met him many times, Matt, as well, is you can understand how his charisma sort of pulls people with him. And, you know, he will always say the things that people want to hear. Now, that's not necessarily good for if you're being consistent about what your your platform is that you're going to sort of deliver for the country. And it also means that you make lots of promises along the way that maybe could be contradictory if you give them to too many people all at the same time. And eventually some of these things caught up with him, as we know. But he certainly is someone who, when he walks into a room, you can see why he was a bit of a magnet for people who wanted someone who could inspire them.
So then, obviously, like you said, he then went as a result of what, you know, as quite often, someone's strengths then become their weaknesses. Boris Johnson goes. Liz Truss, sum up Liz Truss for us.
Okay, so probably as I'm leaving, I can be a little bit more freewheeling with some of the things that I sort of think in relation to how the party has panned out over the last 4 or 5 years. And the way I see it is Liz, and I know Liz, we were ministers together in the Department for Education. When I first got in under Michael Gove, it was me, Liz, and Matt Hancock, who were
what a group,
the three amigos. Yes, and so I knew Liz a little bit then, but it was clear right from the start that our politics was very different, and that's been borne out in the sort of different directions, sort of where we sit within the party. So we didn't really have a lot in common, if I'm brutally honest. And when it came to the leadership election, I made the, as it turned out, rather fatal error of saying the words Rishi and Sunak in the same sentence quite early on as the person that I was supporting. And once we got down to the final 2 candidates, when it was going to the membership, which was Rishi and Liz Truss, as everyone remembers, I sort of knew as I would at that stage have been brought back into government by Boris Johnson when he had to form one, having resigned. So I came back in as Solicitor General, which I loved. I only fortunately did it for 63 days because I was one of those many, many Rishi supporters who got sacked by Liz Truss. And that, that's again, you've got to roll with these things. That's the nature of the beast. But I think that was just sort of recognizing in my own mind that I was about as far away from her within our party as anybody could be. And I was never going to make the cut in those circumstances.
It's interesting that you, Liz Truss, Matt Hancock, Michael Gove, how have you managed to be the only one who hasn't disgraced themselves?
Well, there were other ministers there as well. I think David Laws was there, who I'm actually still friends with, and actually was a great minister, I have to say. He was often he had ideas which were slightly more right wing than my ideas, but that was good. That's a good coalition. But I can't speak for others. All I can say is, for me, I've always treated politics as a job rather than a way of life. And if I get promoted to do something, that's great, but I still need to be doing something where I feel it's justified for the purpose of public service, for being involved in politics. It's not just be there for the sake of being there. It's be there to actually do something meaningful. And so I sort of kept my head down, really. I haven't sort of courted the media. I'm not someone, no offense, but I don't really have journalists on speed dial. I talk about the things that I know about and care about and want to promote. But outside of that, I sort of just keep myself to myself a little bit. And maybe
that's kept you out of trouble a bit as well. Yeah.
It's
also kept you out of trouble.
Rishi Sunak, we should complete the set then. Sum up Rishi Sunak in a word.
Well, in a single word, competent. I think probably, he's, for many people in a different era, if we weren't at this stage of a parliament or the party having been in power for as long as the Conservatives have this time around, I think he has a lot of the attributes that people want in a prime minister. And there's no doubt in my mind. I remember when he was a local government minister. I think I was out of Parliament at the time, but I went to go and see him. That's right, because I was chair of CAFCAS, and he's got an insatiable appetite for getting into the detail, wanting to understand a problem. He's a problem solver, basically, and that's no bad thing in a prime minister. I think what's been tough for him is people forget he's not actually been in politics that long. And he's had to grow into the job as Chancellor very quickly and now Prime Minister. And that makes it harder for him to get who he is and what he stands for across this sort of part of the cycle. I think I backed him for the leadership of the Conservative Party. I thought he was relative to the other options, was the outstanding candidate. I hope that he gets a chance to prove himself for longer than just a couple of years. I think he's also got built around him. Bringing back David Cameron, I think, was a really smart move. He's got our international credibility levels up from where they were. So he's someone who we should, I think, be quite proud to have as a prime minister, just irrespective of his background and his ethnicity. Someone who is sort of a serious guy who, on the political stage internationally as well, is well respected. But as I say, we're at this stage of the sort of run into an election where there'll be all sorts of soundings off and caricatures, and which don't necessarily be that helpful. But I like him, and I really do hope that he gets a chance to carry on.
Finally, then, some classic exit interview questions. Would you recommend this job to friends, family, someone you cared about?
I wouldn't say you should never do it, because we need really great people from all walks of life to come into politics. I think you have to have some sort of warning signs put up around it. It's changed in the time that I've done it, particularly social media is a real scourge for MPs, particularly if you if you interact with it in the wrong way. It can become really quite a painful experience. All of us have had. I mean, I think you've struggled to find any MP who hasn't had a death threat online at some stage. I think the last one I had was about a month ago, which all have to be taken seriously for obvious reasons. So there is that sort of the darker side that has grown, and the discourse has started to become more febrile. But there are still a lot of things that you can do that can make people's lives better if you really commit yourself to politics, public service. I always say you don't have to be an MP to get involved in politics. There's lots of different ways to do it. You can be a researcher, you can be a campaigner, you can work for a charity, you can be a broadcaster, journalist. There's lots of different ways that you can influence the direction of the country. So I wouldn't say don't do it, but I think there's just some health warnings around this is the reality of what the job is, because you can get sort of taken away with the sort of bright lights and the excitement of what political life might or might not be like.
So finally then, Edward Timpson, as we're not sure yet when the election is going to be, but it's coming at some point and you're standing down. Classic exit interview question. What will you do next?
Well, one of the reasons I'm standing down is, unlike last time when I didn't know it was going to happen, I didn't have a chance to make a plan, whereas this time I had time to think about, well, are there other things I want to achieve in life? As I said, I've just turned 50. I've got a chance to still do something quite substantial in my professional life. I was lucky I got elected only at the age of 34, so I've got most of politics out of my system. But the issues that I really care about, mainly around children, families, that's something I want to go back to. So before I was in politics, I was a family law barrister, doing mainly children's cases, children being taken into care by local authorities, contact disputes, that type of thing. And my stint as Solicitor General, albeit it was for 63 days, you do get to take silk. So that's basically means that you're a senior barrister, and that's not a bad thing to take back into practice. So I've rejoined my old barristers' chambers up in Chester, and probably going to start doing a little bit more practice with a view to potentially getting on the bench and be a family judge in the future, and basically take me back to where I started, which is helping families try and sort out their problems. I would have thought I'd have enough of that with 4 kids at home, but so light relief away from home. But that's just one of the plans I have. There's other things that I've got potentially lined up.
Not the family business then. Could you fix a pair of shoes?
Yeah, I did an apprenticeship. Yeah,
did you?
I did. I spent 6 weeks in Northwich, and then I did about 3 months in the basement of Selfridges. But unfortunately, that came to a bit of a sticky end because one day I managed to slice the top of my thumb off on one of the scouring machines. Blood everywhere, passed out on the shop floor in front of the customers, which is slightly embarrassing. But I did discover they got their own little hospital up in Selfridges, or certainly a doctor's room where they stitched me up and gave me a tetanus jab. But that was my sort of way of saying to myself, I think that's a sign maybe the business isn't for me. I'll leave it to my elder brother. And that turned out to be a very good decision.
Edward Timpson of Timpsons, but not of Timpsons. No, Conservative MP for Edisbury, at least until the next election. Thanks for joining us for your exit interview.
Thanks, Matt. Really enjoyed it.